The first time I realized my family had decided my future without me, I was standing in my own living room, barefoot, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. My mother was on speakerphone. She didn't know I was listening. "Well," she said lightly, the way people do when they think they're being reasonable. "We agreed it's better if Olivia doesn't get involved. She wouldn't understand the responsibility anyway." Someone laughed on the other end. My uncle, I think. Another voice added, "She's always been emotional. This kind of decision needs a steadier hand." I remember looking around my apartment, the quiet, the clean lines, the life I'd built piece by piece without help, and wondering which version of me they were talking about. The imaginary one they'd kept in their heads for years? The one who stayed small so they could stay comfortable? I didn't interrupt. I didn't announce myself. I didn't even make a sound. I just listened as my family calmly reassigned control over something I had spent 15 years preparing to protect. What they didn't realize, what made that moment almost surreal, was that the decision they thought they were making had already been made. By me. Legally. Quietly. Irrevocably. They believed power came from age, from titles, from being the loudest voice in the room. They believed authority belonged to whoever sat at the head of the table. They never once considered the person who'd been setting the table all along. And that misunderstanding was about to cost them far more than money. It was going to cost them the illusion that they had ever been in charge. I've been the reasonable one for as long as I can remember. Not the successful one, not the impressive one, just the one everyone assumed would adapt. In my family, being reasonable was a polite way of saying convenient. My name is Olivia Carter, and I'm 33 years old. I grew up in a house where decisions were made loudly and often, but never with me in mind. My father, Richard, liked to say he ran the family like a business, which was ironic because he ran both with the same flaw. He listened only to himself. My mother, Elaine, believed harmony was more important than truth, which usually meant agreeing with whoever spoke last and loudest. Then there was my older brother, Mark. Mark was the anointed one. He spoke with confidence, even when he was wrong, especially when he was wrong. Family gatherings had a predictable rhythm. Mark would announce an opinion, my father would nod approvingly, my mother would smooth things over, and everyone else would fall into line like it was choreography they'd practiced since birth. And me? I was the one who brought extra napkins, the one who remembered birthdays, the one who stayed calm when tempers flared. The glue, my mother liked to say. Glue doesn't get credit. It just holds everything together until it dries out and gets scraped away. I learned early that if I wanted something, asking directly wasn't the way. I learned to listen instead, to watch how people moved when they thought no one was paying attention, to notice patterns. Who interrupted whom? Who deferred? Who pretended not to care while caring the most? That habit followed me into adulthood. While Mark chased visibility, titles, promotions, LinkedIn posts that read like acceptance speeches, I chose something quieter. I studied estate law, then asset governance, then long-term fiduciary structures that most people find so boring their eyes glaze over by the third sentence. I loved it. There's a strange power in understanding systems no one else bothers to read. Contracts people sign without comprehension. Clauses everyone assumes are standard because the font is small and the language sounds polite. Power, I learned, doesn't announce itself. It waits. My grandfather, Samuel Carter, was the only one who ever noticed that about me. He didn't say much, he never had, but when he looked at you, it felt like he was actually seeing the person standing in front of him, not the role they played in the family play. When I was in my 20s, still early in my career, he asked what I was working on. I explained, carefully, simply. He nodded once and said, "Good. Someone needs to understand where things really go." that was all. When he passed away last year, the family grieved loudly. There were speeches, long embraces, stories retold with dramatic pauses. Mark spoke at the memorial. Of course he did. He talked about legacy, about leadership, about continuing what Grandpa started. No one asked me anything, and I didn't volunteer. Because grief has a way of making people careless. They assume the future will look like the past. They assume roles don't change just because someone important is gone. A week after the funeral, my mother invited everyone over to talk logistics. That phrase alone should have made them nervous. We sat around the dining table I grew up with, the one that still wobbled slightly on the left side, because my father never fixed anything unless it affected him directly. Papers were spread out neatly in front of Mark. Color-coded tabs, highlighted sections. He looked very official. "This is straightforward," he said, before anyone else spoke. "Dad and I went through the documents. I'll be handling the estate matters. Investments, properties, distributions. It makes sense." It always made sense when Mark said it. My mother nodded. "You're so good with these things." That was news to me, considering Mark once lost a passport and blamed the airline. I glanced at the documents from across the table. I recognized the formatting, the structure, the deliberate simplicity that hides complexity underneath. They were looking at a surface layer and mistaking it for the whole thing. No one asked my opinion, which was, frankly, consistent. I sipped my tea and listened as decisions were assigned, responsibilities distributed, assumptions cemented into fact. They spoke as if the matter were settled, as if authority naturally flowed toward whoever wanted it most. At one point, my uncle joked, "Olivia's probably relieved she doesn't have to deal with any of this." I smiled politely. Because here's the thing they didn't understand yet. I wasn't relieved. I was prepared. And preparation has a very different ending than silence. No one in my family has ever asked me a direct question unless it was followed by an expectation. Can you come early? Can you handle this? Can you just take care of it? Questions, yes. Curiosity, no. So when Mark announced he'd be handling the estate matters, no one turned to me and asked what I thought. They assumed, correctly, that I wouldn't interrupt. They assumed, incorrectly, that my silence meant agreement. Silence is a funny thing. People treat it like emptiness, when in reality, it's often storage. I let the meeting end the way they wanted it to end. Papers were gathered. My mother hugged everyone a little too tightly. My father clapped Mark on the shoulder like he'd just been promoted to something important, which, to be fair, was how Mark interpreted most pats on the shoulder. As they were leaving, my mother lingered near the doorway. "You're okay with all this, right?" she asked, already nodding as if she'd heard yes. I smiled. "Of course." That answer worked for her. It always had. What she didn't ask, what no one ever asked, was why I had moved back to town 3 months before my grandfather died, or why I'd taken so many afternoons off work to visit him, or why he'd insisted we meet privately, without lawyers, without family, without noise. People assume proximity means access. They assume closeness is measured in volume. They're wrong. My grandfather didn't trust noise. He trusted patterns. In his last year, Samuel Carter had become quieter, but sharper. He noticed how often Mark talked about the estate as if it were already his. He noticed how my father framed decisions as tradition instead of choice. He noticed how my mother avoided conflict by pretending it didn't exist. And he noticed me. He asked once, "Do you know why people fight over money?" I gave him the answer everyone gives. Greed. He shook his head. Control. Money just gives them permission. That was the first time we talked about authority. The real kind. Not titles or signatures or whose name appears first on a letterhead. The kind that sits beneath everything else, quietly directing traffic while everyone argues over the steering wheel. He showed me documents, early drafts, old structures that had been revised over the years, trusts layered inside trusts, each one built not just to distribute assets, but to restrict behavior. You don't reward people for who they say they are, he told me. You reward them for what they do when they think no one's watching. He didn't say this accusingly. He said it like a man explaining gravity. When I left those meetings, I didn't feel powerful. I felt responsible. There's a difference. Power makes people loud. Responsibility makes you careful. That's why I didn't correct Mark at the table. Letting people believe they're in control is often the safest way to see what they'll do with it. Over the next few weeks, my family became very busy spending money they didn't technically have yet. Mark talked about rebalancing portfolios, despite not knowing the difference between liquidity and liability. My mother discussed renovations to the house. Nothing dramatic, just updates, which in her language meant expensive things justified as necessities. My father began hinting at early retirement, as if it were already funded. I watched, quietly. I also received emails, not from my family, from financial institutions. Requests for confirmation, subtle inquiries, clarifications phrased so politely they almost sounded optional. They were contacting me because, buried beneath the surface-level documents Mark was waving around, there was a line that mattered more than all the others combined. Trustee oversight. My name. That line hadn't changed in 15 years. I didn't respond right away. There's a specific kind of confidence people have when they think nothing can stop them. I wanted to see how far it would go. At one point, Mark called me. "I might need you to sign something," he said casually. "Just a formality." I asked what it was. He hesitated. "Standard authorization stuff. Nothing complicated." That's usually the moment when something is very complicated. "I'll take a look," I said. He sighed, already annoyed. "You always want to read everything." Yes, that was kind of my thing. After we hung up, I sat at my desk and laughed. Not out loud, just that quiet internal laugh you get when a situation crosses from frustrating into absurd. They thought I was cautious because I was unsure. They thought I was slow because I was hesitant. In reality, I was waiting for something much more useful than approval. I was waiting for proof. If you were in my place at that moment, watching people you loved step confidently toward a line you knew they were about to cross, would you have warned them? Or would you have stayed quiet long enough to let them show you exactly who they believed was entitled to decide? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. By the end of the month, the line was crossed. And once that happens, there's no pretending it was an accident.
The thing about assumptions is that they're harmless until someone acts on them. Mark's assumption was simple. He believed authority flowed naturally to whoever spoke first and loudest. He'd grown up watching it work that way. My father spoke, everyone listened. Mark spoke, people nodded. Silence in that ecosystem wasn't wisdom, it was surrender. So when his emails stopped asking and started informing, I knew we'd reached the next phase. The first message came from a regional bank manager I recognized. Polite, professional, a little too careful with his wording. "We've received a request to restructure several accounts connected to the Carter Family Trust. Before proceeding, we just need confirmation from the listed trustee." Listed trustee. That phrase has a way of clarifying things. I didn't reply immediately, not because I didn't know what to say, but because timing matters. Respond too early, and people scramble. Respond too late, and damage gets done. There's a narrow window where truth lands hardest, when confidence has already inflated, but before reality intervenes. In the meantime, Mark kept moving. He scheduled meetings. He spoke about strategy. He used phrases he'd picked up from business podcasts, synergy, leverage, optimizing exposure, none of which he could define if asked directly. It was impressive in the way confident nonsense often is. At one family dinner, he announced he was streamlining things.
I'm consolidating some assets, he said, spearing a piece of chicken like it had personally offended him. It's inefficient to keep everything so fragmented. My father nodded approvingly. That's leadership. My mother smiled, relieved someone else was making decisions so she didn't have to. I took a sip of wine and asked, "Which assets?" Mark waved his hand. "The usual ones." That answer meant absolutely nothing, and we all knew it. No one challenged him anyway. That was when I realized something important. This wasn't about money to them. Not really. It was about permission. About who got to decide without asking. About rewriting the family hierarchy now that the one person who'd quietly balanced it was gone. And they had decided it wouldn't be me. A few days later, I received a document Mark wanted me to sign. It was labeled temporary authorization, which is a phrase that should always make you deeply suspicious. Temporary has a way of becoming permanent when no one's paying attention. I read it once, then again, then a third time slower. The document didn't give him full control. That would have required more signatures, more oversight, more awareness. What it did was subtler. It allowed him to act on behalf of the trust in time-sensitive matters. Time-sensitive is one of those phrases that can mean anything you want it to mean. I called him. "You didn't mention this was about authorization," I said. He laughed like I was being quaint. "It's just to avoid delays. You know how these things get." I did know how these things get. That's why I hadn't signed it. "I'm not comfortable with this," I said. There was a pause on the line, a short one, but revealing. "Olivia," he said, lowering his voice the way people do when they think they're being patient. "You're overthinking it." There it was, the sentence I'd heard my entire life. Overthinking, emotional, cautious, careful to the point of inconvenience. Labels have a funny way of being used as evidence. "I'll review it with counsel," I replied. That's when his tone changed. "Why would you need a lawyer?" he asked. I smiled, even though he couldn't see it. "Because that's literally my job." Another pause, longer this time. He muttered something about making things harder than they needed to be, and ended the call. That night, I lay awake longer than usual. Not anxious, just alert. The way you feel when you know a storm has formed but hasn't broken yet. The next morning, the storm arrived. My mother called, her voice tight with concern. "Mark says you're blocking things," she said. Blocking. Such an interesting word. It implies obstruction, not protection. "I haven't blocked anything," I said calmly. "I just haven't approved it." "Well," she replied, hesitating, "he's under a lot of pressure. Maybe you could just trust him?" Trust. Another word people like to use when they don't want to explain themselves. I thought about telling her the truth right then, about the structure, about my role, about the fact that nothing Mark was doing could move forward without me, not legally, not functionally. But I didn't. Because this wasn't about clearing up confusion anymore. This was about watching how far they were willing to go without consent. Later that afternoon, the bank manager called again. "This is unusual," he said carefully. "We've received conflicting instructions." That was the moment. Assumptions had become actions. Actions had created risk. And risk has a way of forcing clarity. I told him I'd be in touch shortly and hung up. Then I laughed, out loud this time. Not because it was funny, though part of it was, in the way watching someone try to open a door they don't have the key to can be funny, but because the irony had finally crossed into undeniable territory. They thought I was slowing things down. In reality, I was the only thing keeping everything from collapsing under the weight of their certainty. And they still didn't know it. Not yet. That realization settled in my chest, heavy and calm at the same time. The truth was ready. All it needed was the right moment to be heard. There's a particular kind of confidence that comes from not knowing you're wrong. It's louder than real confidence. Faster, sloppier. That was the energy in my parents' house the following Sunday when we gathered again, this time under the pretense of clearing the air. My mother had cooked too much food, as she always did when she was nervous.
My father sat at the head of the table like a judge who already knew the verdict. Mark arrived with a leather folder tucked under his arm, the same one he'd been carrying around for weeks like a prop in a play he'd cast himself as the lead. I arrived empty-handed. That alone seemed to unsettle him.
"We need to be aligned," my father began, folding his hands together. "There's too much at stake for misunderstandings."
Translation?
Stop slowing things down.
Mark opened his folder and slid a stack of papers across the table toward me.
"I revised the authorization, made it simpler."
Simpler in this case meant more dangerous. I didn't touch the papers. I didn't even look down at them. Instead, I asked, "Did any of you read the trust agreement?" There was a brief silence. Mark frowned.
"We've gone over the important parts."
"That's not what I asked." My mother shifted in her chair. "It's very long, Olivia." It was. That was intentional. Trust agreements are rarely written to be user-friendly. They're written to be precise. They're not bedtime stories. They're instruction manuals for people who think they already know how things work. "Which part did you read?" I asked.
Mark leaned back, exasperated. "The distribution section, the numbers."
Of course he had. People who chase control always skip the conditions. They go straight to the rewards. I nodded slowly. "Did you read the governance clauses?" Blank looks. "The fiduciary controls?" More silence. "The revocation triggers?"
Mark laughed, short and sharp. "You're making this sound dramatic."
I smiled. "Contracts usually do when you don't read them." That earned me a look from my father, the kind that used to shut me up when I was younger. The kind that said, "Don't challenge me in my own house." But I wasn't younger anymore. And this wasn't his house. Not in the way that mattered.
"You're overcomplicating things," he said. "This is family."
"That's exactly why it was written the way it was," I replied. I reached into my bag and pulled out a single document. Just one page. No color-coded tabs, no highlighting. Clean. Simple. I placed it on the table between us. "This," I said, "is the control clause." Mark leaned forward, scanning it, his brow furrowed. He read it once, then again. My mother leaned over his shoulder. My father adjusted his glasses. The room grew quiet in a way that felt different from before. Heavier. More focused. "What does this mean?" my mother asked. "It means," I said calmly, "that the trust doesn't operate on majority opinion. It operates on compliance." Mark looked up.
"Compliance with what?"
"With behavior," I replied. "With intent. With the conditions Grandpa laid out." My father scoffed.
"That's absurd. You can't control people from beyond the grave."
I almost laughed. "He didn't," I said. "He set boundaries. There's a difference." I pointed to a line halfway down the page. "Any attempt to consolidate, transfer, or reallocate assets without unanimous trustee approval triggers an automatic freeze." Mark's face went pale. "That's not," and, I continued, "any trustee acting outside their defined scope forfeits their authority." My mother looked between us, confused. "Trustee? Mark's the trustee." I shook my head gently. "No, Mark is an administrator." The word landed like a dropped plate. "Administrators execute," I said. "Trustees decide." Mark's voice tightened.
"And who exactly is the trustee, Olivia?"
I met his eyes. "I am." Silence. Not the awkward kind, not the polite kind. The kind that makes people suddenly aware of their own breathing.
"That's not possible,"
my father said finally. "It is," I replied.
And it's been that way since I was 18. Mark stood up. You're lying. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just slid another document onto the table. Signature, date, witnesses. My grandfather's handwriting was unmistakable. He chose me, I said. Not because I'm older, not because I'm louder,
but because I understand restraint. Mark stared at the paper like it had personally betrayed him.
This is ridiculous, he said. You don't even live here. I smiled. Neither does the trust. That was the moment something shifted. Not acceptance, far from it, but awareness. The dawning realization that the story they'd been telling themselves no longer fit the facts in front of them. My mother's voice trembled. Why didn't you tell us? I thought about that for a moment. Because the truth is, I could have told them years ago. I could have corrected every assumption the moment it formed. But then I wouldn't have known how easily they confused authority with entitlement. I didn't think you needed to know, I said honestly. Until now. Mark sank back into his chair, stunned. For the first time in his life, he wasn't holding the pen, and he didn't know what to do with his hands. The strange thing about revealing the truth is that people rarely respond with understanding. They respond with denial first. Mark was the fastest. This doesn't make sense, he said, pushing the papers away from him like they might bite. If this were real, someone would have said something. I resisted the urge to point out that I was literally saying something right now. My father leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Your grandfather was old. He was confused toward the end. That one stung more than I expected. Samuel Carter had been many things, quiet, stubborn, deliberate, but confused was never one of them. Even in his final months, he'd been sharper than all of us combined. He knew exactly what he was doing. That was the problem. He was very clear, I said. He reviewed this structure every 5 years, with professionals, independently. My mother pressed her hands together. So what? You're saying Mark can't do anything? I'm saying Mark can do exactly what his role allows, I replied. Nothing more, nothing less. Mark let out a sharp laugh. So I answer to you now? The question wasn't angry, it was wounded. And for a split second, I saw what this really was for him. Not just control, not just pride, but identity. He'd built his sense of worth around being the decision-maker, the responsible one, the man who took charge. Now he was being told he'd mistaken proximity for authority. I'm not your boss, I said evenly. I'm the trustee. My father stood. This is absurd. You expect us to just accept this? I shrugged slightly. You don't have to accept it. Mark's eyes narrowed. But the structure doesn't require acceptance, I said. Only compliance. That word again. Compliance. It's funny how much people hate it when it applies to them. The conversation unraveled quickly after that. Voices rose, accusations flew. My mother cried, not dramatically, but in that quiet, overwhelmed way that makes everyone feel guilty, even when no one has actually done anything wrong. At one point, my father said, You've always thought you were smarter than everyone else. I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, well, maybe a little, but because it was so deeply wrong. I'd never thought I was smarter. I'd just known I was paying attention. I don't think I'm smarter, I said. I think I'm more careful. That didn't help. Eventually, the meeting ended the way all unbalanced conversations do, with no resolution and a lot of resentment. Mark stormed out first. My father followed, muttering something about betrayal. My mother lingered, standing awkwardly in the kitchen like she didn't know where to put her hands. You could have told us, she said softly. I nodded. You could have asked. That landed harder than I meant it to. After she left, I sat alone at the table for a long time, staring at the grain of the wood I'd known since childhood. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't upset. I was tired. Not of them. of the assumption that being quiet meant being passive. The next morning, the consequences began.
The trust accounts froze automatically, just as the agreement specified, triggered by Mark's attempted consolidation request. Nothing dramatic, no alarms, no phone calls in the night, just a calm, orderly pause. Banks sent notices, investment managers asked questions, schedules were delayed, access was restricted, and suddenly, everyone wanted to talk. Mark called me 6 times before noon. I didn't pick up. My father left a voicemail that sounded like a negotiation disguised as a lecture. My mother texted, "Can we please talk?" I waited until the afternoon before responding. Not out of spite, out of necessity. If I moved too quickly, they'd mistake restraint for weakness again. When I finally answered Mark's call, his voice was different. Tighter. Less certain. "They're saying I can't approve anything," he said. "That's correct," I replied. "This is insane." "No," I said gently. "This is exactly how it was designed." He exhaled sharply. "Why are you doing this?" That question mattered, because if I answered it wrong, this would become a war instead of a correction. "I'm not doing anything to you," I said. "I'm doing what Grandpa asked me to do. Protect the trust from being used carelessly." There was a long silence on the line. Then quieter, "You could ruin me." I closed my eyes. Power isn't about ruining people. That's what people without power think it's for. "I don't want to ruin you," I said. "I want you to stop." Another pause. "And if I don't?" "Then the trust continues without your involvement," I said, which was always an option. He laughed bitterly. "You planned this." I smiled to myself. I prepared for it. After we hung up, I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. Here's the part no one tells you about finally being seen as the authority. It's lonely. Not because you lose people, but because you lose the version of them that only existed when they thought you didn't matter. And that loss, oddly enough, feels like relief. If you were in my position, knowing you could step in and take full control, or step back and let everything unravel, would you tighten your grip, or would you let people face the limits of their own decisions? I'm curious what you'd do. Tell me in the comments. I really do read them all. By the end of the week, the family wasn't arguing anymore. They were waiting. And waiting is usually the moment people finally understand who gets to decide. Waiting changes people. At first, my family treated the freeze like a temporary inconvenience, a glitch, something that would resolve itself once everyone calmed down and I inevitably did the thing they expected me to do. Smooth it over, step aside, let Mark resume his role as lead adult in the room. That expectation lasted exactly 4 days. By day 5, the tone shifted. It started with logistics, the unglamorous kind of problems people never imagine when they picture money. Automatic payments that didn't process. Advisors who suddenly wanted written approval instead of verbal assurances. A contractor who paused renovations because a deposit hadn't cleared. Nothing catastrophic, just friction. Friction is unbearable to people used to things moving when they say so. Mark showed up at my apartment unannounced on Thursday evening. I knew it was him before I opened the door. He knocks the way he does everything else, like the door owes him access. He looked tired, not physically, emotionally. The confidence he usually wore like armor was cracked around the edges. "We need to talk," he said. I stepped aside and let him in. He paced while I made coffee. The same apartment my mother once described as cute but temporary. The same one Mark had never visited before the trust froze. Funny how curiosity follows inconvenience. "This has gone far enough," he said, finally stopping. "People are asking questions." I handed him a mug. "They should." "That's not what I mean," he snapped. Then, softer, "You're embarrassing me." There it was. Not "we're exposed," not "we made a mistake," I don't like how this makes me look. I didn't embarrass you, I said calmly. You did. I just didn't stop it. He stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Not as his younger sister, not as the agreeable one, but as an obstacle. You always do this, he said. You sit back and judge. I almost laughed. Almost. I don't judge, I replied. I document. That shut him up. He ran a hand through his hair. What do you want? That question is revealing. It assumes everything is a negotiation, that authority is transactional, that control can be bargained back if the price is right. I want the trust to function as intended, I said. Nothing more. That's vague. No, I said. It's just inconvenient. He leaned against the counter, defeated. Dad's furious. I know. Mom's barely sleeping. I know. And I'm the one everyone's blaming. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. You're being blamed because you took control without consent, I said. That's not leadership. That's entitlement. He flinched. I didn't enjoy that. Despite everything, I didn't want to hurt him. But clarity often feels like an attack to people who've never been questioned. I didn't think it mattered, he said quietly. That's the problem, I replied. You didn't think. He left shortly after that. No resolution, no apology. Just the sound of the door closing a little harder than necessary. The next call came from my father. This one wasn't angry. It was strategic. He invited me to lunch, neutral ground, as if we were diplomats instead of family. He chose a restaurant that liked to pretend it was casual while charging $20 for salad, the kind of place where decisions are discussed in low voices and no one wants to be overheard. He didn't waste time. You've made your point, he said, folding his napkin carefully. Now we can move forward. Move forward was his favorite phrase. It meant go back to how things were, but without me admitting fault. I'm not trying to make a point, I said. He frowned. Then what are you doing? I'm enforcing boundaries. He sighed. You're being rigid. I smiled politely. You're being unfamiliar with consequences. That earned me a look. He leaned in. This family doesn't function when people act unilaterally. I raised an eyebrow. That's interesting, coming from you. He opened his mouth, closed it, took a sip of water. For the first time, he didn't have an immediate response. That's when I knew something had changed. They weren't waiting anymore. They were recalibrating. That weekend, my mother asked to come by alone. No Mark, no father, just her. She sat on my couch, twisting her wedding ring the way she does when she's anxious. She looked smaller somehow, less certain. I didn't realize how much responsibility you carried, she said quietly. I didn't respond right away, because that sentence was close, but not quite there yet. She continued. I think we all assumed, well, that you'd always adjust. There it was. Not malicious, not cruel, just profoundly revealing. I adjusted because no one else did, I said gently. She nodded, eyes wet. I see that now. It wasn't an apology, but it was a beginning. After she left, I sat alone and let the silence settle. Here's the truth no one in my family wanted to face. They didn't lose control because I took it. They lost it because they never actually had it. They'd been operating on habit, on hierarchy, on the assumption that authority belonged to whoever had always held the microphone. But systems don't care about volume. They care about structure. And I had built mine carefully. By the end of the week, the waiting had transformed into something else. Caution. And caution, unlike confidence, asks permission before it moves. For the first time, my family wasn't deciding what would happen next. They were asking. And that, more than any document or title, was how I knew who truly held the power. The first real shift didn't come with an apology. It came with a question. Mark asked it, reluctantly, during what was supposed to be a check-in call that my mother had insisted on hosting. She framed it as a chance for us to reconnect, which was her way of saying, please don't let this turn into something we can't undo. We were all on the line, me, Mark, my parents. No lawyers, no advisors, just family, stripped of props. For the first 10 minutes, everyone spoke in circles. Words like alignment, intent, moving forward, floated around like balloons no one wanted to grab. It was exhausting. Finally, Mark cleared his throat. "What exactly are we allowed to do?" he asked. The line went quiet. It was the first time anyone had asked me that. Not, "Why are you doing this?" Not, "How do we get around it?" But what are the rules? I leaned back in my chair and smiled, just a little. "That," I said, "is a much better question." I walked them through it slowly. Not as a lecture, not as a power move, but as information. Clear boundaries, defined roles. What required approval, what didn't. What behaviors triggered oversight. What actions restored trust. I didn't editorialize. I didn't shame. I just explained. My father interrupted once. "That seems restrictive." "Yes," I replied. "That's the point." Silence. Mark asked another question, then another. Each one peeled back a layer of assumption he'd been operating under for years. He was realizing something uncomfortable, that what he'd thought was authority had actually been permission granted by people too tired to challenge him. At one point he said, almost to himself, "So I can't just decide things because I think it's best?" I paused before answering. "You can decide anything you want," I said. "You just can't act on it unilaterally." My mother exhaled. "That sounds fair." Fair is a funny word. People only use it when the rules stop favoring them. By the end of the call, no one was arguing anymore. No one was defensive. They were focused, careful, slightly humbled. When we hung up, I sat there for a moment, letting the quiet settle. This was the phase no one talks about, the in-between. After the illusion breaks, but before something healthier replaces it. It's awkward, uncomfortable, full of recalibration, and it requires patience. A few days later, Mark emailed me. Not a demand, not a complaint. A draft proposal. He'd outlined an idea for reallocating part of the trust's funds into a lower-risk investment vehicle. He'd included reasoning, projections, contingencies. It wasn't bad. It wasn't great either, but it was thoughtful. I replied with feedback, questions, suggested revisions. We went back and forth twice. Then I approved a limited version of it. The world didn't end. Mark called me afterward. "I didn't realize how much work this actually is," he admitted. I smiled. Most people don't. That was the beginning of something new. Not equality exactly, but balance. He was learning to operate within structure instead of dominance. My parents were learning to pause before assuming. And I was learning something too. That authority doesn't have to be loud to be respected. It just has to be consistent. There were still moments of tension. Old habits don't die quietly. My father occasionally tried to suggest decisions in a way that felt suspiciously like instructions. My mother still defaulted to smoothing things over instead of addressing issues directly. And Mark still struggled with the fact that he wasn't the final word. Once, during a meeting, he said, "I think we should just go ahead and—" He stopped himself mid-sentence, corrected course. "I think we should discuss whether it makes sense to—" Progress. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Control doesn't need applause. One evening, after a particularly long day of reviewing documents,
I caught myself laughing at the irony of it all. For years, I'd been labeled the difficult one because I asked questions. Now, those same questions were the only thing keeping everything functional. If I'd known that was all it took, I might have charged consulting fees. The real change came when my mother visited again. She brought a folder. "I found these," she said, setting it on the table. Inside were old notes, letters from my grandfather, drafts of earlier versions of the trust documents, things she'd never read closely before. "I didn't understand why he structured it this way," she said softly. "I do now." She looked at me, not with guilt, not with pity, but with something closer to recognition. "I'm glad it's you," she added. That sentence mattered more than any apology could have. Because it wasn't about forgiveness, it was about acknowledgement. That night after she left, I stood by the window and watched the city lights flicker on, one by one. For the first time, I wasn't bracing for the next conflict. I was setting terms. And my family, finally, was learning how to listen. There was still one conversation left to have. One decision that couldn't be postponed any longer. But now, when the question of who gets to decide came up, no one wondered where the answer lived. They already knew. There's a point in every conflict where logistics stop being the issue. What remains is identity. For my family, that point arrived when the topic they'd been carefully dancing around could no longer be postponed. The house. The Carter house wasn't just real estate. It was history, memory, and ego poured into brick and wood. My parents had lived there for over 30 years. Every holiday, every argument, every unspoken hierarchy had been reinforced by who sat where at the table and whose voice carried through the walls. The house was also expensive. Maintenance costs were rising. Property taxes had jumped again. And the trust, construct, deliberately, had been covering the gap for years. No one wanted to talk about that. Until Mark did. He brought it up during what was supposed to be a routine update call. His voice was careful, measured, like someone handling glass. "So," he said, "we need to discuss the long-term plan for the house." My father stiffened immediately. "What's wrong with the house?" "Nothing," Mark replied quickly. "It's just not efficient." That word again, efficient. My mother glanced at me through the screen. She didn't say anything, but I could tell she'd known this was coming. I didn't interrupt. I waited. Mark continued. "The trust can't keep absorbing the costs indefinitely. It doesn't make sense financially." My father bristled. "This is our home." "I know," Mark said, "but we need to think practically." There it was. The moment they'd been avoiding. The collision between emotion and structure. Between what we've always done and what we can realistically sustain. All eyes turned to me. Not accusatory, not defensive. Expectant. It was a strange feeling. Being looked at not as the problem, but as the arbiter. I took a breath. "The house can stay," I said. "Under conditions." My father leaned forward. "What kind of conditions?" I didn't soften my voice. I didn't sharpen it either. I kept it steady. "Transparency," I said. "Shared responsibility. And a plan." Mark nodded slowly. My mother looked relieved. My father looked wary. "The trust isn't a safety net," I continued. "It's a tool. If the house remains, it has to exist within the same framework as everything else." My father frowned. "You're talking about rules." "Yes," I replied. "I am." He sighed. "I never thought my own daughter would put rules on our home." I almost smiled. "I never thought my family would assume I wouldn't," I said. There was a beat of silence. Then, unexpectedly, my mother laughed. Just a little. "Well," she said, "if we're being honest, the roof does need replacing." Mark snorted. "And the plumbing." "And the wiring," my mother added. My father glared at both of them.
I raised an eyebrow. See? Consensus. That broke the tension more than I expected. Even my father cracked a reluctant smile. We spent the next hour doing something my family had never done before. We planned. Not vaguely, not optimistically, but realistically. Budgets, timelines, responsibilities. What the trust would cover, what it wouldn't. What would happen if conditions weren't met? It wasn't warm, it wasn't nostalgic, but it was honest. At one point, my father muttered, "Your grandfather would have enjoyed this." I nodded. He did. After the call ended, I sat back and felt something unfamiliar. Not victory, relief. Because the hardest part hadn't been asserting authority. It had been watching people I loved struggle with the idea that care and control aren't the same thing. A week later, my father called me directly. No agenda, no preamble. "I've been thinking," he said. That alone was progress. "I always assumed leadership meant deciding for everyone," he continued. "Turns out, it just meant no one else ever learned how." I didn't respond right away. I let the weight of that settle. "I don't expect forgiveness," he added. "But I want you to know, I see it now." That wasn't an apology, but it was accountability. And accountability, I've learned, is far rarer. Later that evening, Mark sent me a message. "I reread Grandpa's notes," it said. "He really did think this through." I replied, "He trusted us to learn, eventually." There was a pause before his next message appeared. "I'm still getting used to not being the one in charge." I smiled at my phone. "So am I," I typed back. Because here's the thing no one warns you about when you step into authority. You don't just change how others see you. You change how you see yourself. For most of my life, I'd defined myself in opposition to my family's expectations. The quiet one, the overlooked one, the one who adapted. Now there was nothing left to push against. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was choosing. And that realization, more than any document or decision, was the real inheritance my grandfather had left me. The house still stood, the trust still held, the family still had work to do. But the question that once hovered over every room, who gets to decide, had finally found its answer. And it wasn't up for debate anymore. The strangest thing about finally having authority is realizing how little you want to use it. Once the house issue was settled, the air shifted. Not dramatically, no tearful speeches or sudden warmth, but something subtle loosened. Conversations slowed down. Decisions stopped being rushed. No one tried to get ahead of anything anymore. Control had stopped being the prize. Stability had taken its place. That was new for my family. Mark adjusted first, which surprised me. I'd expected resistance to calcify, not soften. But once he stopped trying to win, he started paying attention. During our weekly trust reviews, he came prepared, not with grand ideas, but with questions, practical ones. What happens if the market dips again? Do we have contingency coverage for this? Is this timeline realistic? They weren't power plays, they were collaborative. At one point, he caught himself mid-sentence and laughed. "I sound like you." I raised an eyebrow. "Careful, that's how it starts." He groaned. "God help me." Humor, I've learned, is a sign of safety. People only joke when they don't feel threatened. My parents changed more slowly. My mother tried first, in her way. She started asking before assuming. Small things at first. Would it be okay if, instead of, "We're going to..." She still over-apologized, still tried to smooth every edge. But now, when I set a boundary, she didn't push against it, she respected it. My father was harder. Not angry, just displaced. Men who've defined themselves by authority often struggle when authority becomes shared. He'd spent decades being deferred to. Now, deference was no longer automatic. One afternoon, he called and asked if we could talk. "I feel unnecessary," he said,
after a long pause. I closed my eyes. That sentence held a lifetime of fear. "You're not unnecessary," I said carefully. "You're just not the final word." He laughed softly. "That's a hard adjustment." "I know," I replied. "It was for me too." That surprised him. "What do you mean?" "I spent most of my life being told I wasn't meant to decide," I said. "Learning that I could was just as disorienting." We sat with that for a while. Then he asked something that would have been unthinkable months earlier. "What would you do if this were your family?" I smiled. "It is." That answer changed something. Not overnight, but permanently. The final test came unexpectedly. An opportunity arose, a tempting one. A high-yield investment pitched by an old associate of my father's. It promised fast returns and minimal risk. The kind of offer that makes people forget caution. My father brought it to Mark. Mark brought it to me. "I don't like it," Mark said up front. "But Dad's excited." I reviewed the proposal quietly, thoroughly. Then I shook my head. "It doesn't fit." Mark sighed. "I figured." He paused. "Do you want me to tell him, or will you?" That question mattered, because it meant he wasn't defaulting anymore. "I'll tell him," I said. When I called my father, I explained the decision. No judgment, no lecture, just reasoning. He listened. Then he said, "I still think it could have worked." "I know," I replied, "but the trust isn't about chasing possibility. It's about preserving certainty." Another pause. Then, unexpectedly, he said, "Okay." Just like that. No argument, no resentment. After the call, I sat there for a long time, stunned. That was the moment I understood something essential. Authority isn't proven when people obey you. It's proven when they stop fighting you. Weeks passed. The trust stabilized. The house repairs began. Family gatherings grew calmer, less performative, more real. One evening, during dinner, Mark joked, "Remember when we thought Olivia was just the quiet one?" My mother smiled. "I don't think she was ever quiet." "No," my father said thoughtfully. "She was listening." I raised my glass. "Still am." They laughed, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a joke at my expense. Later that night, alone in my apartment, I reflected on how far things had shifted. I hadn't taken control away from my family. I'd returned it, to the system, to the structure, to the values my grandfather had believed in when he chose me. And in doing so, I'd given my family something they'd never had before: clarity. There was one final step left, not for them, for me. Because authority isn't just about setting rules for others. It's about deciding what you no longer need to prove. And I was finally ready to let go of that. The last thing my grandfather ever gave me wasn't written down. It wasn't in a trust document or buried in a clause no one bothered to read. It wasn't financial or legal, or anything that could be transferred with a signature. It was certainty. I realized that on a quiet Sunday morning, months after everything had settled, I was sitting at my kitchen table, sunlight cutting across the floor, coffee untouched because I'd forgotten it was there. My phone buzzed once, just a calendar reminder for the weekly trust review. Nothing urgent, nothing dramatic. That alone would have been unthinkable a year earlier. For most of my life, I'd measured peace by the absence of conflict. If no one was upset, if no one needed me to fix something, I assumed things were fine. That instinct had made me adaptable, agreeable, invisible, useful, but never settled. Now, the silence felt different. It wasn't avoidance, it was alignment. The trust no longer required constant oversight because the people involved finally understood the boundaries. My parents had adjusted their lifestyle to what made sense instead of what looked good. Mark had found a role he was actually good at: execution with accountability, not dominance with guesswork. And me? I'd stopped bracing for the moment I'd be dismissed again. That's what I'd kept. Not control, not authority, not even respect, though that had come too. I'd kept my center. A few weeks later, we gathered at the house for dinner. The same dining table, the same wobble on the left side, but the energy was unmistakably different. No one rushed to fill silences. No one performed competence. No one deferred just to keep the peace. At one point, my father started to say something, stopped, and looked at me. "What do you think?" he asked. Not rhetorically, not politely, genuinely. I answered. We discussed it. We moved on. No tension, no subtext. Later, as I was leaving, my mother walked me to the door. "You know," she said, hesitating, "I used to think strength looked a certain way." I waited. "Loud," she continued. "Certain, unyielding." She smiled softly. I was wrong. I hugged her. Not tightly, not loosely, just enough. Driving home, I thought about how many years I'd spent trying to be seen as capable instead of simply being capable. How much energy I'd wasted proving myself to people who were never really watching. Authority didn't come when I demanded it. It came when I stopped explaining myself. Back at my apartment, I took the framed copy of my grandfather's signature out of a drawer, the one I'd never displayed. I set it on my desk, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. He hadn't chosen me because I was perfect. He'd chosen me because I understood restraint. Because I knew that real power doesn't rush in, doesn't shout, doesn't need to be defended every second. It waits. And when it finally speaks, it doesn't need to argue. For years, my family had asked the wrong question. Who should decide? The real question had always been simpler. Who is willing to carry the weight of the decision? Quietly, consistently, without needing credit. Now, everyone knew the answer, including me. And that was enough. In the end, nothing exploded. No doors were slammed, no one was cut off or cast aside. What changed was quieter than that, and far more permanent. My family didn't suddenly become perfect. We still disagreed, we still stumbled, but the balance shifted. Decisions were no longer made by whoever spoke the loudest or assumed the most. They were made by the person willing to carry the responsibility all the way through. And for the first time in my life, that person didn't have to apologize for it. I didn't win by taking something from them. I won by refusing to disappear anymore. If this story made you think about family, about power, about the moments where staying silent feels easier than standing your ground, then you're not alone. These are the stories we rarely talk about, but all recognize when we hear them. If you want more stories like this, stories about quiet strength, long patience, and the kind of justice that doesn't need to shout, make sure you subscribe to the channel. New stories are coming, and you won't want to miss the next one. Thank you for listening.